Lecture 6, Augustine, Part 1.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we examined the athletes of God, which is to say Christian ascetics of late antiquity. We examined the emergence of monasticism from the deserts of Egypt, and we took a look at some of the arguments that are articulated about the relative merits of virginity and celibacy and marriage in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Today we're going to examine the most famous thinker of late antiquity, St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo. Of all the people who lived during the 4th and early 5th centuries, Augustine is the one whom we know the most intimately. And this is thanks in part to a spiritual autobiography that he wrote, called the Confessions. Augustine wrote the Confessions, which has some claim to being the first autobiography ever written in Western literature, when he was about 43 years old. This is a problem for historians because he did not die upon completion of this work, so much of his life goes unchronicled in the Confessions. And the Confessions is a problematic text in some ways because it recounts Augustine's spiritual journey toward Christianity. As a result, Augustine will go into great length over events that historians are perhaps not overly interested in, such as his theft of pears when he was an adolescent. But he will neglect details that historians would dearly love to know. For example, he never tells us the name of the concubine with whom he lived for about 15 years. And if any listeners ever discover this name, please let me know immediately. We'll be rich and famous together. He barely mentions his brother, and we think he might have had 2 sisters based on what he says in the Confessions, but it's not entirely clear. Much of his family life does not appear in this spiritual autobiography. Nonetheless, despite its limitations as a historical document, the Confessions opens up a remarkable window into the mind of an individual who lived during the 4th and the 5th centuries. We also know Augustine unusually well because he accidentally did us a huge favor shortly before his death. He dies in 430, and in 428 he wrote down a list of everything he had written up to that point in time, which is to say most of his vast corpus, and he indicated the date at which he wrote each of these works in the precise order in which he had written them. Now, when studying an ancient thinker such as Plato or Aristotle, there's always considerable argument over what order these books should be placed in order to trace the evolution of Plato's thinking, for example. Augustine made it clear for us. We know exactly what he wrote, when he wrote, and based on this list, we are confident that we possess today virtually everything that Augustine wrote, that almost nothing has perished. So we have a almost complete overview of his thinking at various points in time. And it is very well that we have this spiritual autobiography and this marvelous list of his writings, because Augustinian thought was going to be an incredibly powerful influence in Europe for well over a millennium. And Augustine's ideas about human nature, about history, about Rome and classical culture and paganism, on the relations between religious and secular authority, are going to be read and debated and argued over for a long time to come. Augustine is born in 354, and he's a North African. He comes from Algeria, born in the town of Thasgate. He's a citizen of the Roman Empire, but he's a provincial and feels his provincial background somewhat keenly throughout his life. He comes from a relatively modest family of some local importance, but certainly not of great imperial importance. His father is a pagan by the name of Patricius. He is a member of the local town council, so he's a relatively important figure in the hometown, but outside of that town, no one would have known who he was. He seems to have been a relatively remote figure in Augustine's early life. His mother is a Christian by the name of Monica. And Monica was a very pious and devout woman who was going to play a dominant role in Augustine's life and has some claim to being a late antique mother. Augustine, although he's very influenced by Monica from the beginning, is not baptized as a Christian and appears to have been raised as a pagan, as a youth. Education offered Augustine his ticket out of the boonies and out of North Africa. And he studies both in his hometown at Thasgate and at Carthage, the major city in this part of North Africa. And he decided to focus his academic endeavors on the field of rhetoric, which is the art of speaking and writing persuasively. Romans regarded rhetoric as the ultimate academic pursuit. It's the most impressive, the most prestigious field that one can undertake. If you master rhetoric, there's nothing that you cannot do. And a strong foundation in rhetoric would open up various career opportunities to Augustine and might allow him to leave North Africa and travel to Italy and perhaps even to Rome itself. If you studied rhetoric and mastered it, well, you might become a lawyer, you would be well qualified to become a government official, or you might become a teacher. While he's studying rhetoric in North Africa during his late teens, Augustine also took a concubine. Now, if someone were to introduce you today to his concubine at a cocktail party, you would be taken aback, because concubines have a relatively dubious reputation. But within the Roman Empire, at least in pagan circles, concubinage was regarded as a respectable relationship, and one with legal obligations on both parties. It's an alternative to marriage, and it is suitable for people of different social classes who are forbidden by law to marry. It is suitable for people who want to live in a long-term monogamous relationship with a member of the opposite sex, but one that does not necessarily entail a lifetime commitment to the other person. We know that Augustine spent 15 years with his unnamed concubine, and we know that he had a child, a son, by the name of Adeodatus, who was born probably around 373 and died in 389. Augustine's path to Christianity was long and complicated, and in many ways his life and career encapsulates some of the broader changes that are taking place in the 4th and early 5th centuries. Late in adolescence, he explored Christianity to a certain extent. He was curious about the Christian religion, but upon reading the Christian Bible, he found its Greek to be very plain and poor, and he's an aspiring rhetorician to whom style is everything. And so he decides that Christianity is not for him, and instead he becomes a Manichaean. The religion of Manichaeism had emerged from the Persian Empire during the 3rd century A.D. Its founder is a somewhat obscure figure by the name of Mani. Mani is familiar with Christian writings. He's read the letters of St. Paul. But Manichaeism should not be regarded as an offshoot of Christianity, because it incorporates elements of Persian religion and even of Indian religion as well. As for what Manichaeism taught, Manichaeism maintained that good and evil were equally powerful and equally eternal in the universe, that God and Satan were sort of locked in permanent equilibrium, and neither one nor the other would be able to vanquish their opponent. Matter in the material world, everything that you see around you, has been created by Satan. Spirit in the spiritual world has been created by God, and therefore the material world is wholly evil, wholly corrupt. The spiritual world is wholly good. In Manichaean cosmology, particles of the good spiritual world had become trapped here in the material world. The human soul is such a particle of good that has been trapped, and it is the duty of Manichaean believers to liberate these particles of good so that they can return to the spiritual realm where they belong. And the way for Manichaeans to liberate the good that is trapped in the evil material world is through personal asceticism and through vegetarianism. Augustine was attracted to Manichaeism because it answered an important question that was bothering him, and that was the question of why evil exists in the world. According to Manichaeism, the answer is that evil exists in the world because God, purely good, can't do anything about it. Evil and good are equally powerful, and therefore neither can drive out the other. Although Augustine found this answer, at least as a teenager, to be satisfying, Manichaeans were regarded with horror by contemporary Catholics, and indeed they looked upon Manichees, the way that inhabitants of Middle America looked upon communists in the 1950s. The mere mention of the name Manichae would make the little hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. When Monica found out that Augustine had become a Manichae, she refused to let him in the family house, only relenting later. Augustine wanted to go to the big show and travel to Italy and see whether he could make it there as a rhetorician. And he leaves North Africa to go to Rome in 383. He had great expectations for what he would encounter there. The students undoubtedly will be much better than the students in North Africa. After all, they are in Rome. But he was very disappointed by what he encountered there. He found the students relatively apathetic towards their studies. And fairly quickly after going to Rome, he wanted to get out again and find a position elsewhere. He caught a lucky break thanks to the intervention of a Roman official by the name of Symmachus. Symmachus was prefect of the city of Rome, which was a very important office in the Roman Empire. And Symmachus was given the responsibility for appointing a new professor of rhetoric for the city of Milan. This was an especially important teaching post because at this moment in time, Milan was the imperial capital of the western half of the Roman Empire. The emperor and his court were residing in Milan. For much of the 4th century, emperors moved around from city to city. And so Augustine, if he was the chief professor of rhetoric in Milan, he would be responsible for making speeches in front of the whole of the imperial court and in making public speeches on behalf of the emperor. So this was a teaching post that one would keenly like to have. Symmachus himself was a remarkable figure in the late 4th century. He came from an old senatorial family, was very proud of his background, and he's a pagan. And he's openly a pagan in a world that is becoming increasingly Christianized. When the Emperor Gratian yanked the altar of victory out of the Roman Senate house following the death of Julian the Apostate, Symmachus petitions Christian emperors and begs him to restore the altar of victory to its rightful place, which was a fairly courageous stand to take. And he would often intervene with Christian emperors on behalf of pagans. Symmachus, as a pagan, was attracted to Augustine, the Manichaean, because they're both on the outs. And in a way, appointing a Manichaean as a professor of rhetoric in Milan was a jab at Catholicism. And as a result, they formed an alliance of sorts, and Augustine gets the job. Augustine's stay at Milan was going to be relatively brief, only a handful of years, but it was going to be very eventful, in part because of the people whom he was going to encounter in the city. Perhaps the most important acquaintance he made there was with the Christian bishop, Ambrose, whom we encountered in the last lecture. That the Manichaean Augustine and the sort of Catholic bishop Ambrose should encounter each other might seem odd, but Ambrose had the reputation for being a master of rhetoric himself, and so Augustine attended his sermons in order to learn something about good Latin declamation from Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose, in addition to being a master rhetorician, was also a remarkable figure in terms of his personal courage. For during the period of late antiquity, it would be correct to see secular authorities as dominating religious authorities, more often than not. Roman emperors followed the lead of Constantine and the precedent that he had established in the Council of Nicaea, where he summoned a church council and then laid down the law concerning Arianism. And they liked to order Christian officials around and tell them what they should decide at any given church council. There were a few exceptions, however, and there were a few remarkable instances when an important church leader was able to humble and to impose his own will on an emperor. And Ambrose was one of the few late antique Christian officials who was able to do this. In 390, riots had taken place in the Greek city of Thessalonica. A very popular chariot racer there had been arrested and charged with being a male prostitute. The inhabitants of Thessalonica were outraged at the arrest of this popular athlete, and they killed the Roman officials who were responsible for his arrest and riot in the city. The emperor, Theodosius I, the one who outlaws paganism in 391 and 392, would not tolerate this act of insubordination, and so he massacred many of the inhabitants of Thessalonica to punish them for daring to attack imperial officials. Ambrose of Milan, in turn, denounced the massacre of the inhabitants of Thessalonica by the emperor and claimed that even though Theodosius is emperor, nonetheless, he has no right to violate divine commands, such as thou shalt not kill, and therefore he must do penance for the murder of the inhabitants of Thessalonica. Theodosius did not want to sort of submit himself to the judgment of Ambrose on this matter, and situation grew even worse when Ambrose went so far as to excommunicate the emperor, throw him out of the church, essentially. No Christian was supposed to have any contact with him until he had atoned for this massacre. It looked as though Ambrose might be next on the hit list. Theodosius, at one point, surrounds the church over which Ambrose presided in Milan, and Ambrose gathered his followers within the church and barricaded themselves in, expecting the attack. Theodosius himself attempted to march into the church, but is met at the doorway by Ambrose, who folds his arms and simply will not let him in physically. But Theodosius decided that massacring Bishop Ambrose and his followers in the church would be very unseemly, and he gives in. Remarkably enough, he agrees to accept the penance imposed upon him by Ambrose so that the sentence of excommunication would be lifted. Ambrose is the exception rather than the rule. Similar conflicts between religious and secular authorities in which the religious authority triumphs, while these aren't going to become commonplace in medieval Europe until the 11th and 12th centuries, to the extent that they become commonplace at all. But the episode with the emperor at least reveals something about Ambrose as an individual and why Augustine would find him so compelling. At Milan, in part as a result of the sermons that he hears preached by Ambrose, Augustine begins to move away from his Manichaeism. And he abandons it, but does not move straight into Catholicism or Christianity. Instead, he at first begins to dabble in a philosophical movement known as Neoplatonism, which is based upon the work of a Greek inhabitant of Egypt named Plotinus, who died in 270 AD. Now, Plotinus was himself a pagan, but nonetheless, there are a fair number of Christian thinkers in late antiquity who attempt to reconcile Neoplatonism as expounded by Plotinus with Christian belief. Now, the Neoplatonists did not think there was anything neo about them. They never called themselves the Neoplatonists. They simply called themselves the Platonists because they regarded themselves as simply presenting Plato's ideas as Plato would have wanted them to be understood. In fact, though, what they teach is something rather different from what Plato seems to have intended, and so modern historians append neo to their label. Manichaees saw evil as a permanent and powerful force in the world, a force as powerful as good. Neoplatonists moved almost to the opposite end of the spectrum and denied the existence of evil in the world. That which seems to be evil to you, such as a flood, a tornado, a hurricane that closes your college down for 2 weeks and deprives you of electricity, that's not evil. That was merely the absence of good. All you see around you is imperfection, and evil is not an active force on a par with good. It's a rather optimistic doctrine. Neoplatonists maintained that human happiness is achievable in this world. If you devote yourself to philosophic contemplation, you can rise above the imperfections that are around you, I should say. As a Neoplatonist, Augustine entered the period of his greatest intellectual optimism. His writings as a Neoplatonist maintained that it is possible for humans to achieve happiness, and he sees human beings as free moral agents in control of their own destinies, not caught between principles of good and evil, and he emphasizes the importance of free will in human action. His stay in Milan was not just intellectually tumultuous as he abandoned his Manichaeism and adopts Neoplatonism. Augustine's stay in Milan was also personally tumultuous because his mother followed him there. In 386, Monica comes to Milan and begins to meddle in Augustine's life. She convinced Augustine to dump his concubine, which he does. She goes back to North Africa while Deodatus stays with his father. And Monica began to arrange a marriage between Augustine and a wealthy Catholic heiress, seeing this marriage as advancing Augustine's career. Monica also became a devoted follower of Ambrose, setting up a very interesting psychological triangle because she develops a separate relationship with Ambrose. And she admires Ambrose very deeply, crediting him with luring Augustine away from Manichaeism. In the summer of 386, July of 386, in a garden near Milan, Augustine underwent a profound personal crisis and decided to make a near total life change. He was going to abandon his career as a professor of rhetoric, the career for which he had worked so hard. He was going to quit his teaching post at Milan. He was going to give up on the idea of marriage, much to the disappointment of his mother. And instead he was going to devote himself full-time to philosophy and to a more religious life. And he decided that he was going to convert to Catholicism. Ambrose himself baptizes Augustine in 387, and Augustine decided that he was going to return home to North Africa to see what sort of life might wait for him there. On his way back to North Africa, Monica died, and shortly thereafter his son also died, Deodatus, leaving him relatively alone in the world, at least in terms of family connections. He arrives in North Africa in 388, gathers around him a group of like-minded Catholic friends, and they establish a religious community, a lay religious community, at his hometown. He remains part of this community in his hometown until 391, at which point he traveled to the town of Hippo. And while he was there, local inhabitants shanghai him and force him to become a priest in the town. And shortly thereafter, in 395, he is elevated to the office of co-bishop. He will remain Bishop of Hippo from 395 until his death in 430, when the city was being besieged by barbarian Vandals. As Bishop of Hippo, Augustine abandoned his Neoplatonism. He became convinced, based on his personal experiences, that Neoplatonism was overly optimistic and therefore misguided. The devotion to philosophic contemplation that Neoplatonism offered as the roots of human happiness seemed impossible to achieve. He could just never find the time to devote himself entirely to philosophic studies. His life was filled with too many anxieties and cares and concerns for him to achieve happiness. Even worse, Augustine found that being celibate was a lot harder than he thought it was going to be, that he was constantly struggling against carnal temptations. If Manichaeism had made evil seem too strong and too permanent, well, Neoplatonism made evil seem too weak. Indeed, it denied it its existence. And for Augustine, evil was too permanent part of a human condition, too sort of present in his world for him to simply dismiss its existence. In rejecting Neoplatonism, Augustine also abandoned the notion that humans had substantially free will in which they could make their own moral choices. And Augustine emphasized more and more in his writings the extent to which human beings found themselves locked into patterns of behavior that they could not break, doing wrong despite themselves, despite knowing that it was wrong. One of Augustine's favorite examples, most persuasive examples, concerns swearing. He wrote about how many contemporaries knew that you should not take God's name in vain, and yet at the first opportunity would let loose with a string of oaths, repent, but then do the same thing the very next day. And Augustine came to see this as emblematic of the human condition. You're constantly doing things that you knew you ought not to be doing. And so Augustine's search for an explanation about why evil is in the world and why it is as powerful as it is was going to have to continue. The shift in Augustine's thinking, his abandonment of Neoplatonism, was very much rooted in his experiences as Bishop of Hippo. Both his personal experiences, the difficulty he found in maintaining a celibate lifestyle, but also in his professional experiences, because bishop was a very burdensome job. And he became embroiled in a number of scandals that caused Augustine to grow rather bitter. Not everyone had wanted him to become co-bishop of Hippo in 395. Some were jealous of him. One of his rivals accused him of sending love potions to a married lady in an attempt to discredit him, and Augustine was stung by this accusation. Even worse, Augustine was responsible for presiding over the local episcopal court and hearing the cases that came before the court. And these cases were often civil cases over property, and day after day, Augustine had to sit and listen to litigants who appeared greedy and vindictive and petty, arguing over whose piece of land belonged to whom. And it was like driving on I-95 in the Northeast. You were seeing human nature at its absolute worst, and all you could do was abandon any hope that there was anything redeeming about the people with whom you had to deal. And as a response to his presiding over this law court and having to see human beings in this way, Augustine's thought was going to become bleaker and bleaker as he served as Bishop of Hippo. In addition to his professional experiences, pushing his thought in directions that his thought might not have gone in otherwise, Augustine also became embroiled in a number of theological controversies that would also force his thought into new directions. One of the most important of these controversies was a local one, a North African matter, that concerned Donatism. Now, Donatism centered on the question of whether priests and bishops who were morally deficient in some way were nonetheless capable of administering sacraments. Does your ability to perform a sacramental function depend on your own worth as a person, or is it something separate entirely? As for why this was such a major issue, well, during the persecutions of Diocletian, some Christian clergy had cracked under the pressure, and they had done things that they should not have done. They would hand over copies of the Bible, for example, to Roman authorities. And these clergy who had broken were known as traditores because they had handed things over that they should not have done. Donatists, who were very strong in North Africa, stronger than Catholics during Augustine's lifetime. They outnumber Catholics in Hippo, certainly, and they're even stronger in the countryside. Donatists maintained that clergy who had cracked should be stripped of their office, that they could not serve as clergy anymore because they had failed God. And this controversy continued for decades, long after the conversion of Constantine, because Donatists also maintained that clergy consecrated by those clergy who had cracked dozens of or decades of years ago, they're also unworthy to exercise the office of priest or bishop. So this controversy was going to continue. Augustine, though, argued in response to the Donatists that he needed to be somewhat more lenient towards the clergy who had cracked, that they were still worthy of administering sacraments in God's eyes. Here, too, once again, you see Augustine somewhat moderate compared to his contemporaries. And that those who had been consecrated by clergy who had succumbed to pressure during periods of persecution are legitimate clergy and should be regarded as such. And the argument over Donatism might seem rather abstract and arcane, but some of the arguments that Augustine made about what should be done about the Donatists were going to have important repercussions throughout the Middle Ages. Constantine himself had ruled against the Donatists, and he and his successors sporadically attempted to persecute the Donatists in various ways, driving them out of public office. For example, closing down Donatist churches. In 405, the imperial government issued an Edict of Unity, which branded the Donatists as heretics and disbanded the Donatist church and ordered all Donatist bishops to be removed from office. Augustine supported the Edict of Unity and penned a number of important arguments that stated that it was legitimate for secular rulers to use coercion against religious heretics, that it was right for emperors to try and force Donatists against their will back into the Catholic Church. And it was right because, for all anyone knew, this was God's way of achieving the salvation of the heretics. It might be in their own best interests. And Augustine's decision to take this stand and to argue that it is legitimate to use secular authority against heretics and to force heretics back into the church is an argument that will be echoed in later centuries when heretical movements would emerge in various parts of medieval Europe. To conclude, Augustine is probably the most influential thinker to emerge during late antiquity, and his own life and career encapsulate some of the broader changes that are taking place. He is born a pagan. He is groomed to be a professor of rhetoric. He has a long-term relationship with a concubine and is a father, but he ends up a Christian, a bishop, and a celibate. As Augustine grows older, after he becomes Bishop of Hippo, his thought becomes increasingly bleaker, and he starts to formulate some of the ideas for which he is best known, ideas that are articulated in his masterpiece, The City of God. In our next lecture, we will examine the second half of Augustine's life, paying special attention to this remarkable book.